Mies van der Rohe ist kaum mit Worten zu greifen.
Mies van der Rohe can hardly be grasped with words because his architecture is truly located in the realm of art. And Mies van der Rohe is about beauty, truth, and spaces that Mies created, which are broken down to their very existence
Untergebrochen sind. Mein Name ist Wita Noack.
My name is Wita Noack. I have been the director of the Mies van der Rohe House, formerly Haus Lemke, since 1992.
Ehemals Haus Lemke.
Ein Satz, der 1924 ein Schlusssatz in
A sentence in one of his lectures in 1924 is perhaps characteristic of the whole of Mies, where he says we want to stand with both feet firmly on the ground, but we want to reach our heads into the clouds.
Auf der Erde stehen, aber unseren Kopf wollen wir in die Wolken recken. Mein Name ist Fritz Neumeyer. Ich bin promovierter Architekt.
My name is Anja Guttenberger, and this is my podcast, Bauhaus Faces. Welcome to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces. I'm Anja, your host. I know it's been a while since my last episode. This time, you had to wait a little longer for a new episode to come out than usually, and I'm really sorry about that. This new episode is about Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, a very big name of a very famous and internationally influential architect. And that's probably why it took me so long to finalize this episode. Since I never researched Mies van der Rohe myself, I was anxious to be unable to do him justice. So I asked 4 experts, yes, you heard right, 4 experts, to join me on my podcast. And because Mies's work was so extensive, this episode will be my first 2-parter. Maria Ludwig Michael Mies was born on 27th of March 1886 in Aachen. His career began as a bricklayer apprentice and as a stone carver in his father's workshop. Soon he moved to Berlin to work in Bruno Paul's new architecture office. Paul was a very influential architect and educator at that time, and also one of the founding members of the German Werkbund, an association of artists, architects, entrepreneurs and experts. As soon as in 1907, Mies landed his first order, a house for the philosopher Alois Riehl. It's still a very traditional house, but with modern features. At the Riehl's house, Mies met the dancer Ada Brun, with whom Mies would have 3 daughters. Ada Brun was very understanding and accepting of Mies's way of life. She used to tell her daughters that he needed his freedom because he was an artist, a genius. Brun and Mies separated as early as in 1921. In the same year, Ludwig Mies changed his name to Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, adding his mother's maiden name to his surname, and the van der came into the name now too, probably because of the proximity of his hometown Aachen to the Netherlands. The border is just about 4 kilometers away. His name change also marks his development from a more traditional architect to a more modern architect. However, Mies will always stay connected to the classic architecture of Carl Friedrich Schinkel, for example. He's an exception among the modern architects because his work will always integrate both traditional and modern features. After World War I, and after working not only for Bruno Paul but also for Peter Behrens, Mies founded his own architecture office in Berlin. His breakthrough as a modern architect came when Mies became vice president of the German Werkbund and in this position led the Werkbund exhibition Die Wohnung, the apartment, in Stuttgart in 1927. Most of us know Mies as the 3rd director of the Bauhaus, a successor to Hannes Meyer in 1930 and his numerous attempts to save the Bauhaus from the indiscriminate hate of the Nazis. But Mies was never a Bauhaus architect. He was famous before that, and if anything, the Bauhaus has put obstacles in his way as an architect in Germany. The years after the end of the Bauhaus, 1933 to 38, are political, social and architectural upheaval. Those were the years when Mies still tried to stay in Germany, his home, where his family and Ada Brun and their daughters still lived too. By accepting commissions by the Nazis for big projects like the pavilion for the Brussels World Fair or the Reichsbank, he will have to defend his decisions for the rest of his life. If you think that's all that we are going to say about this, then you're wrong. This crucial period between the last months of the Bauhaus and Mies's emigration to the US will be part 2 of this podcast episode. I will put a magnifying glass over this topic with the help of the expert Aya Soyka, who published a great book about it. So don't forget to listen to part 2 as soon as it comes out. When Mies van der Rohe is no longer able to get any substantial work in Germany and is offered the post of director of the Armour Institute in Chicago, he emigrates in 1938. In Chicago, he's being worshipped for his architecture and will have a second magnificent career there. In the 1960s, he will be the winner of a competition to construct the new National Gallery, the Neue Nationalgalerie in Berlin. This will be his last hooray, the last peak of his career. Here, in the city where he couldn't gain a foothold anymore in the 1930s, Mies combines classical and modern architecture in a temple for art against the background of the divided Berlin, exactly at the weld between East and West. With the Neue Nationalgalerie, Mies closes the circle of his life, architecturally and biographically. In an interview, a German reporter asked Mies in 1961 if he considered to go back to Germany. Mies replied, "It was difficult enough to find new routes for one time, and I don't think it is good to do this a second time. And it is indifferent for the architecture from where you are working too. I would have done in Germany exactly the same thing that I am doing in the US." For today's first part of the Mies podcast, I invited Wita Noack, as head of the Mies van der Rohe House in Berlin, a true expert about Haus Lemke, where the institution is situated, and Fritz Neumeyer, the Mies expert in Germany, who published several books about Mies van der Rohe and his work during the past 40 years. They both decided to talk to me in German. That's why I translated and dubbed what Wita Noack said myself. For Fritz Neumeyer's parts, I asked someone who those of you that listen regularly to Bauhaus Faces already know. It's Konrad Feininger. He is a professional audiobook speaker, and I'm so happy that he has agreed to help transfer the podcast into English for you. This is all perfect for you because this way I will not only post the English version of this podcast, but also 2 German bonus episodes with Wita Noack and Fritz Neumeyer and additional parts that didn't find their way into the Mies podcast. So it is definitely worth listening to all the audio if you can understand German too. This episode has been supported by the Mies van der Rohe House. Thank you so much for the recognition of my work. Let's now dive into a new episode of Bauhaus Faces and shine a light on Ludwig Mies van der Rohe.
Mies van der Rohe hat bei seinem Vater gelernt.
Mies van der Rohe learned from his father, went to craft school and also worked in construction, building simple walls back then in Aachen. There's a story told by the people of Aachen, I don't know to what extent that is really true, that one day he read in an advert in a newspaper while he was working on a building site saying, "The future lays in Berlin." And then this practically very young man went to Berlin in 1905 and then worked in Bruno Paul's office and designed his first residential building for Alois Riehl in Potsdam on Griebnitzsee in 1908. And it's a very beautiful, simple house, still a very traditional house, but with a wonderful garden and situated on an annex and with a view of Lake Griebnitz. That was very important. And this first work by Mies van der Rohe had a great influence on him, especially as the client, Alois Riehl, was a philosopher who had a great influence on cultural life, especially in Berlin. And was certainly there that Mies was put on the track, so to speak, as a philosopher among architects. It was there that Mies met the dancer Ada Brun, who was actually promised to Heinrich Wölfflin. Quick side note from Anja, Wölfflin was a Swiss art critic. Mies stole Ada Brun away from Wölfflin, and they married relatively quickly. And this marriage produced 3 children, 3 girls.
Aus dieser Ehe sind 3 Kinder hervorgegangen, 3 Mädchen.
Und Mies hat sich immer für das Denken interessiert.
And Mies has always been interested in thinking. At the age of 22, he built a house in Neubabelsberg for a respected professor of philosophy at Berlin University. This was his first independent building, and he had a very close relationship with this philosopher Alois Riehl until his death in 1924. He was regarded as a kind of house son of the Riehls and was in and out of the house, even designing the gravestone for Alois Riehl. And I don't think we should underestimate what he learned from Riehl.
Ist, glaube ich, schon mal nicht zu unterschätzen. Bücher, geistige Interessen, Gedankenwelt.
Books, intellectual interests, world of thought. Since he's been in Berlin, but perhaps also in Aachen, this has always been something that was natural for him. And then, at the beginning of the 1920s, he took a very radically materialistic approach with this glass tower block and the concrete office building, and he says, "We don't know any problems of form, only problems of construction," something like that, and basically sawed off the branch he was sitting on. If you're no longer interested in form, then you're no longer doing architecture, and he realized that relatively quickly. And in 1926, he talks about the fact that it is above all important to express spiritual values in architecture, not just technology and materials and construction. And of course, it is the world of forms that expresses this.
Und das ist natürlich die Welt der Formen, die das zum Ausdruck bringt.
Fritz Neumeyer passed by casually Mies van der Rohe's draft of an office building in Friedrichstraße, a famous shopping street in Berlin nowadays. I wanted to know more about this glass high-rise, which was a competition entry from 1921. The jury didn't understand what Mies was doing here. Maybe the look of the high-rise was too futuristic for them and the construction not sophisticated enough. Let's hear what Fritz Neumeyer has to say about this.
Naja, das zeigt, dass Mies eigentlich immer die Fähigkeit
that shows that Mies always had the ability to think things through fundamentally. So, this is an attempt to reduce architecture to something very elementary. And this radical approach, demonstrating it, is important to him. And, if you look closely at the design, it talks about construction. Only the high-rise buildings in the shell show the bold, constructive idea. And then, when these facades are hung in front of them, it all disappears. It seems a bit like a Dadaist operation to me. When you see Grosch or Dix, you see that all bourgeois values are shaved down in their paintings, and then there is only the faceless doll left, the type above all. And I believe that the American role model for this high-rise is to be found in New York, the Flatiron Building. It is also triangular, and there was no specification for the design in terms of the stories for Friedrichstraße. There are also 22 stories, which the Flatiron Building also has. He also had relationships with Dadaist artists at the time, and I could imagine that this is a kind of reaction to the fact that the Flatiron Building is now being shaved, the facade demolished, and the structure left standing. At the time he wrote his first text about how only skyscrapers under construction show the bold, constructive idea, but he doesn't really show it either. He realizes that, too, because when I use glass surfaces, they reflect. I can no longer see anything of this skeleton. He also talks about the skin and bone structure. That would be a case of skin and bone structures where it's just the glass skirt hanging down the building and then the skeleton of the structure. And he also knew that it wasn't solved architecturally either. I mean, he was talking about the construction. And if you look at the floor plan of this design, you don't see a single pillar in it. So the construction disappears completely from the floor plan. You are talking about the construction, but it doesn't even appear in the floor plan. That's bizarre, of course, this contradiction. So I think that's one of his great etudes, I'd like to say, that he makes.
Ich glaube, das ist so eine seiner großartigen Etüden, ja, möchte ich mal sagen, die er macht. Das Moderne und das Klassische.
The modern and the classical don't come one after the other. They always run side by side. And the fact that he designed this glass high-rise for Friedrichstrasse and then in the same year Haus Eichstätt in Zehlendorf, this little cube that stands there, shows that for him these are not necessarily two worlds. They may look completely different at first, as if they have nothing to do with each other, but one thing, you could say, is of course the architectural breadwinning, the other is what I radically put on paper as an idea to exhibit it.
Was ich als Idee radikal für mich zu Papier bringe.
Der hat ja schon nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg.
After the First World War, he had already opened an office here in Berlin near Potsdamer Platz, his own office. And he really planned and built from there. The Weissenhof housing exhibition in Stuttgart was actually more important for Mies and for Mies's life and for his significance today than the Bauhaus was. He was entrusted with its management by the German Werkbund in 1925, and then he designed this estate in Stuttgart with the involvement of international architects. The estate was simply outstandingly designed by him. He himself has built a multi-story building there, an apartment house, and many international architects have been invited. Le Corbusier was there, Aud was there, the Taut brothers were there, Scharoun was there. And this Weissenhof estate in Stuttgart was actually a great international success at the time, so that was actually the most important point. Mies was famous before he came to the Bauhaus.
Also Mies war berühmt, bevor ans Bauhaus gekommen ist, dann später.
1929 war schon ein anerkannter Avantgarde-Architekt.
In 1929, he was already a recognized avant-garde architect. He had already put something on the table. There was already Stuttgart Weissenhof. There were a few houses, Haus Wolf in Güben, for example. There was also the Afrikanische Straße here in Berlin. And these two marvelous villas in Krefeld for Esters and Lange began in 1927 and were completed in 29. So these are great houses. I like them at least as much as Haus Tugendhat and the Barcelona Pavilion. They are perhaps even a little better, because they don't yet have this whole opulent repertoire of natural stone discs that stand freely in the room and appear like modern columns in the room with nickel-plated steel pillars. It is simply made with bricks and steel beams that allow for a large window opening, and it is magnificent in terms of the spatial coherence, this merging of the rooms. There you already have what characterizes the Barcelona Pavilion. That is important to him.
Dieses Ineinanderübergehen der Räume haben Sie da auch schon, das, was den Barcelona-Pavillon kennzeichnet.
For my Mies podcast, I also talked to the Chilean architect Iñaki Bolante, who wrote his PhD thesis about Mies van der Rohe in the 1990s. He is also executive director of Baukunst Academy, a school that teaches in the spirit of Mies van der Rohe about modern architecture. Unfortunately, the audio quality is really bad, and no AI tool could improve it well enough. However, I wanted to include his description of the Barcelona Pavilion in the podcast too. So this is him talking now.
The pavilion is a representation of the technology. On the other hand, it's supposed to be very clear. It has to be simple, not very noise, with not a lot of lights and everything. So he became very interested in the idea of this passage between this great terrace in Barcelona, where is the magic fountain. It's quite important. And then he had the possibility to go ahead to the Poble Español. It's a kind of another representation of the many different cultures in Spain. So he believed that the building could be something that you can go through. And this is very interesting because you got the glasses, so you can see through the space and you get inside and you will find the fountains that is quite interesting. The Colbes sculpture that is called Dawn, that is quite interesting because there is the figure of a naked woman that is becoming shady in the eyes because of the light of the morning. So the integration of architecture and art, and then you got the marbles. The marble is gray and it's green in the other hand, and you got this fantastic travertine that is going all ahead the pavilion with only one plane completely ahead of the whole space, even in the outside, in the inside. Then there is some of the representation of the Democratic Republic of Germany. He used the yellow of the doré, and the roof was black, and the curtain was red. You see, so making this democratic idea of the Weimar Republic, but he was very quiet. But at the time, it was kind of interesting to see the main idea of the glass, for example. These glass were something really new. Lily Reich and Mies make many different pavilions at the Barcelona presentation. The others are quite simple. One is a white box, it's a very interesting white box with some cantilevers in the outside, but it's very simple. But the Barcelona pavilion has something very, very important with the site. He spent 6 months to find the place that the German pavilion will be. But when he found the place, he was very fast and he did this masterwork. It's fantastic.
When the 1929 World Fair ended, the Barcelona pavilion was demolished. Although the silk manufacturer Hermann Lange, for whom Mies van der Rohe had built a house in Krefeld, suggested the pavilion to be rebuilt in the Tierpark in Berlin, this attempt was in vain. The usable building materials of the pavilion were sold. Some parts of it can be found today in the old building of the Saxon State Parliament in Dresden. Between 1983 and 86, though, the city of Barcelona commissioned the architects Cristian Cirisi, Fernando Ramos, and Ignacio de Sola Morales to reconstruct the pavilion according to the original plans on the original site.
Mies hat ja auch sehr viel als Ausstellungsarchitekt.
Mies has also worked a lot as an exhibition architect. I think that is far too underestimated. He made a large part of his living from it, and that's also where the collaboration with Lily Reich comes from. They did an infinite number of exhibitions. If you add that up alone, it's incredibly edifying.
Wenn man das allein addiert, das ist unglaublich.
Mies und Lily Reich, das war schon eine sehr kreative Partnerschaft.
Mies and Lily Reich, that was a very creative partnership. They were also a couple for a while. And when Mies was at the Bauhaus, he also brought Lily Reich to the Bauhaus as head of weaving and interior design. They worked on projects together, such as the Café Samt und Seide. Lily Reich was also involved in the interior design here at Haus Lemke. I think it was a good relationship, a strong relationship that worked very well, especially at work. They both really supported each other. I think that she also advised him very well when it came to which fabrics were used in his buildings, including curtains, silk curtains. So all the buildings have that. Lily Reich certainly played a decisive role here, and she had a good taste and a really good feel for materials and quality. And I think Mies appreciated that very much and certainly benefited from it. The same goes the other way around. Lily Reich also benefited greatly from this connection. And you know that she stayed in Germany and Mies went to America in 1938. Unfortunately, not much happened for her after that. It's a typical artist relationship where people actually support each other through quality. And that was definitely the case here.
Das ist so eine typische Künstlerbeziehung, wo sich die Leute so gegenseitig eigentlich fördern durch Qualität. Und das war auf jeden Fall der Fall.
Gropius geht ja 28.
Gropius left in 1928 and Hannes Meyer became the director. And even then Mies was asked if he would like to take over the position of director, and he said no. When Hannes Meyer was dismissed, the situation was different, and then Mies accepted and took up the position of director in October 1930.
Und tritt dann im Oktober 1930 die Direktorenstelle an. Gropius und Mies ist auch ein sehr delikates Kapitel.
Gropius and Mies, that is also a very delicate chapter. Mies never thought anything of Gropius. For him, he was a kind of architectural imposter. Mies must have already realized this, working with him in Peter Behrens' office. But they respected each other, of course. And Mies wasn't on such good terms with the Bauhaus either. So, when the first Bauhaus exhibition was held in 1923, something by Mies was also shown there, and he traveled there and was horrified by the formalism that was there. And I also found that interesting in one of the last conversations he had with his grandson, Dirk Lohen, 14 days before his death in the summer of 1969. He still remembers his visit to the Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar in 1923 and talks about the desk that Gropius designed for his director's room. A pure ornament. In Mies's eyes, Gropius was probably basically a political organizer of people, but he really didn't take him seriously as an architect. Even in professional circles, it was known that the two were not particularly on friendly terms.
Auch in Fachkreisen wusste man, dass die beiden sich nicht besonders grün waren. Und ich glaube, Mies hat erst diese Direktorenstelle als eine Chance begriffen.
I think Mies only saw this director position as an opportunity when Hannes Meyer was no longer there. And you can see that when he became director, he first tried to somehow make the place neutral again and exmatriculates all the students, and they then had to re-enroll, and by re-enrolling, also declare that they would more or less refrain from political activities at the Bauhaus. Of course, it didn't have much effect.
Hat natürlich auch nicht so viel bewirkt. Ja, hat's eigentlich zu einer Architekturschule gemacht. Das hat aber auch
He turned it into a school of architecture. But Hannes Meyer had already done that too, it must be said. So he didn't change that much. He focused more on architecture and basically, I would say, continued the structure of the Bauhaus as established by Meyer. I mean, what he does in his teaching position there from 1930 until 1933. So hardly anything is done in Berlin, which is only from winter 32 to April. Well, he does mainly residential buildings, and Hilberseimer is there too. They're already building courtyard houses and carpet estates, and the students are still doing that in Chicago. So he takes this task that he gives them, for example, a detached house. A courtyard house is not a typical Bauhaus house, but rather comes from his own architectural practice.
Sondern das kommt eher aus seiner eigenen Architektenpraxis. Wenn man die Bauausstellung in Berlin von 1932...
If you look at the building exhibition in Berlin in 1932, he made a model house that was so spacious and open and like a Barcelona pavilion, only habitable. And instead of a marble disc, there's just a wooden disc that stands in the room and organizes it. This small residential building is the design task for him. And I think he also imagined that he wouldn't be able to build more than detached houses in the time available. And that is also difficult, of course. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and the building exhibition 1932 was already taking place in the hall. Model houses were supposed to be built on the site at the radio tower. This all fell through due to a lack of funds, and perhaps Haus Lemke also has something to do with it. That falls directly into the Bauhaus period. And if you look at the designs that have been handed down from the Bauhaus students in Dessau, they all do more or less the same thing. They all make little courtyard houses like that, and are obviously all brought up to be little Miesians. There's no project that doesn't somehow have the Barcelona chairs and the floor plan, the little crosses for the steel pillars, the open spatial connections. Then there's a wall disc somewhere, which is the cardinal element. They all imitate it badly, and I find that kind of awful.
Die machen alle Mies nach, und das finde ich irgendwie schrecklich.
I couldn't help but think of Pius Pahl when Fritz Neumeyer said this. For those of you who are regular listeners of Bauhaus Faces, you know that I have already published an episode about Pius Pahl too, and how much he was influenced by Mies van der Rohe as an architect and as a teacher. And for those of you who didn't know yet, well, then you have to go back into the timeline and also listen to the episode about Pius Pahl with his sons Till and Peter Jan. I also told Wita Noack about Pius Pahl, and she remembered that he had visited her once in Haus Lemke.
Ja, das ist interessant, wo du gerade den Namen Pius Pahl erwähnt.
Yes, that's interesting now that you mention the name Pius Pahl. And we're here at Haus Lemke, which is now the Mies van der Rohe house as an institution. And I got to know Pius Pahl, who came to visit me here one day. He was already well over 80 or so, and he told me that back when this house was being built, the students from the Bauhaus, Mies' students, visited the house under construction and climbed around on the roof. And there are a number of drawings from the Bauhaus period where Mies' students, for example Pius Pahl, Eduard Ludwig, Rudolf Ortner, etc., also drew houses in class, all of which are very similar to the Lemke house. Mies always gave them tasks that were very small and tangible for a student. And this house fitted in quite well. And practically all of them designed something similar. And then, of course, there's the allegation that they are all little Miesians who imitated their masters, so to speak. But I think what your question intended to ask is, how is that Mies was so idolized? And that's back to what I said at the beginning, that he was simply an artist. He was adored as a person and a genius, so to speak. And that was his special personality, I think. And it's good that you mentioned the IIT as well. He also trained good students at the IIT. Pai was there with him and so on. So he also managed to pass on his knowledge to students, and that good people also emerged from it. And Mies tried to inspire with the way he approached and handled things.
Eigentlich hat er versucht zu begeistern. Die Tochter legte immer sehr großen Wert drauf, dass man zu Mies jetzt nicht unbedingt sagen kann, er sei ein Bauhausarchitekt.
The daughter always attached great importance to the fact that you can't necessarily say that Mies was a Bauhaus architect, because he was already famous beforehand, as I've just explained, and went his own way. And then, after he took over the Bauhaus from Hannes Meyer, which was in a serious crisis at the time, he actually wanted to save it by inviting the students to come to him and saying, "Do you want to study or do politics?" But even Mies couldn't save the Bauhaus, so it was closed in Dessau in 1932. And Mies then made another attempt to continue the Bauhaus in Berlin on a private basis. But that went on for another 2 semesters, and then it was closed again by the National Socialists in April 1933. Mies designed Haus Lemke precisely at the time when he was at the Bauhaus, both in Dessau and in Berlin. It falls into this exact time frame, but he really planned it from his own architectural office and in cooperation with Lillo Reich, and Friedrich Wilhelm Hilz was there, Ernst Walter was there too. So they were involved in this house.
Walter war dabei, also die haben dann hier an diesem Haus mitgewirkt. Dieses Haus Lemke ist das letzte Haus von Mies in Deutschland.
This house for the Lemkes is the last house by Mies in Germany. It is also a low-budget house, so there was really little money. So Lemke wanted to spend 16,000 Reichsmark. If you look at Haus Tugendhat as a counterexample, in inverted commas, the Tugendhat said, "Mies, build us something nice, money doesn't matter." And here was Lemke who said 16,000 Reichsmark and no more. The expectations were high, so there are a number of designs that are assigned to the house here. And in the beginning, there was a 2-story version that Mies designed here. There were variants that were very similar to the Haus Tugendhat in Bruno or the Barcelona pavilion with a large ceiling slab and columns. And then at the end, there is a series of designs that are L and Z shaped. And I assume it was a question of money that this relatively small, simple building was created. But there's also the fact that Lemke repeatedly admonished Mies that he wanted a house that was more connected to the garden. And I think that this L shape, or you could almost say that this last block that jets out, almost a bit Z-shaped even, this special shape of the house helps structure the garden, creates courtyards and spaces of its own, which are then complemented by gardening. That was also the next point. It was important that it happened quickly. There was also an absurdity with Mies. But Lemke must have been a really good businessman to have urged Mies to build it in the shortest possible time. So you have to imagine that today they dug the building pit here in September and the Lemkes moved in April. So it had to be quick, it had to cost little. And the main criterion was the connection between the house and the garden. And I think that wasn't just the pressure from the clients, we want the house and garden to be close together, But it also suits Mies very well. Mies shows in an exemplary way how you can combine architecture and nature. I would say that this house is the best example of this.
Das ist, ich würde behaupten, bei diesem Haus am besten gelungen.
Now that I had Wita here for a conversation about Haus Lemke, I wanted to know everything, not only about the house, but also about its owners, the Lemkes. I was curious to understand what kind of people wanted a house from Mies.
Karl und Martha Lemke, ein kinderloses Ehepaar.
Karl and Martha Lemke, a childless couple, were 45 years old when they built the house. Mies was the same age. Karl Lemke came from a humble background, developed into a print shop owner through hard work and entrepreneurship, and, together with a Jewish businessman, opened a print shop and a graphic arts center. And his company was based in Mühlenstraße near the Oberbaumbrücke. It was a brick building, 5 stories high with several floors, all of which belonged to his company. You can't even imagine that today. Back then, they had to make the photomechanical prints for the book publications. The artists and museums brought their paintings to Lemke's company, and the pictures were then practically prepared there for printing. And Lemke was very well known in Berlin for good quality. He also advised Eminolde, for example, on how best to polish his works to a high standard. They were also really well connected in the artistic community and, as I said, had good quality and a good reputation at the time. And I mean, today you do a podcast or you're on Instagram or you have a website. And back then, publishing via newspapers and books was the medium par excellence. And that was Lemke.
Und damals war ja Veröffentlichung über Zeitungen und Bücher das Medium schlechthin. Und das war Lemke. Es ist ein sehr kleines Haus.
It's a very small house, about 160 square meters. There are 3 main living spaces, each measuring 40 square meters. The house has an L-shaped floor plan with a living terrace grouped around it, so to speak. Brick construction, a flat roof, single story. It is kept very simple towards the street. You basically walk towards the garage door. The entrance to the house is hidden, so you don't get the feeling when you're standing in the street that you're entering a villa, and it is therefore also called Country House Lemke. And it's only when you enter the house that you realize the quality of the house, which is completely oriented towards the garden. The 2 main living rooms, which are grouped around the terrace, face south and west. So they are orientated towards the light and nature. So you look directly from the living room onto the lake, across a sloping garden and a park adjoins the lake. So this is the small house. The garden is huge, 3,000 square meters. To promote this connection between architecture and nature, Mies placed the house on the far northeast corner of the plot. It is so purist here in relation to nature. You have to realize that the house doesn't have a single step. Nature can flow into the house and the inside spills outwards. And that was done deliberately. For example, there's parquet flooring in the main living areas, which then merges into a Weser sandstone terrace, and at ground level the lawn level closes in and actually leads directly to the surface of the lake.
Und führt eigentlich optisch direkt unmittelbar auf die Seeoberfläche. Das Haus hat ja hier ganz viel Licht. Licht, Luft, Sonne.
The house has a lot of light here. Light, air, sun. The sun practically flows through the house. If you think about it, a good counterpart to this is dark wooden furniture. So what I'm getting at is that it's also quite good if you always bring the opposing pairs together. Dark wood, bright light. Wood may go better with a country house than tubular steel. The house was designed by Mies van der Rohe. The interior design of the house was strongly influenced by Lily Reich. They also designed furniture especially for the Lemke house. Some of the furniture was designed by Mies van der Rohe, some by Lily Reich. The entire organization of the furnishings was then supervised. Existing furniture from Lemke's was integrated into the new furnishings. It was supplemented with carpets. Lily Reich was probably decisive here, with curtains, with fabric curtains, the whole color concept. And I always think that Lily Reich stands above all for how objects are organized in a room, so she did that with mastery.
Also das hat sie mit Meisterschaft gemacht. Ich würde ja sagen, die Möbel von Mies sind kleine Skulpturen.
I would say that Mies furniture are also small sculptures. And we have also engaged with that here in the house. For example, they belong in the center of the room because you can practically see them from all sides like a sculpture. So they are beautiful pieces of furniture, again really willful in the sense of Mies. So you can clearly assign them to him. What perhaps occurs to me on this subject is to come back to the Lemke house. People always associate Mies with this tubular steel furniture, but the Lemke house was not furnished with tubular steel furniture at all, but with wooden furniture. So Mies also learned how to work with wood from Bruno for a while. Our furniture is now in the Kunstgewerbemuseum, Museum of Decorative Arts in Berlin, and includes a library cabinet, a beautiful desk made of Macassar ebony, a desk chair, a small coffee table, and an armchair. And he also made a distinction. It's quite clear that wooden furniture perhaps belongs in the living area. But if you're furnishing cafes or schools or entrance halls, it might be tubular steel furniture. So he played on several levels and variations. I would say that furniture simply belongs in a large area of architecture. And it wasn't just chairs or armchairs, but also tables. He designed everything, right down to the bookshelves. He started even earlier. The first chair was designed for the Weissenhof estate, the famous Weissenhof chair, which dates from 1927. So I don't think it was the Bauhaus that influenced Mies, but rather his use of new technologies, new materials and technologies. Simply that they tried to work not only in wood, but also in steel, which is what these gas pipes were that were bent. And perhaps one line of influence was this light chair without back legs, where you practically float. I think that's more of a cultural thing. How do you make a person float with furniture? It was exaggerated even further to the point of sitting on air. But I think that when you sit on it, you also look very good as a person, because it creates such a unity between body and sculpture.
Aber ich finde, wenn man drauf sitzt, sieht man auch als Mensch sehr gut aus, weil das begründet so eine Einheit zwischen Körper und Skulptur. Ich würde noch eine Besonderheit erwähnen.
I would like to mention another special feature that really makes the difference to the earlier villas. This Lemke house is the kind of building you would imagine today, because his earlier villas were all built for people who lived in the houses with stuff. There are whole floors for nannies like the Tugendhat house, for cooks, for gardeners, in other words, stuff. And here, the Lemkes, they were already so modern and they said, we don't need that, the house is too small, we want to run it on our own. And a housemaid would only disturb us here anyway. They were also a married couple who were very connected to each other. But that in turn means that we don't have all these floors here with the small rooms. In other words, the spatial layout is very radical. That's the advantage and that's the modernity. And I would say that this house also points the way to America. If you stand there in the Lakeshore Drive apartments or something like that, then you have the proportions that are here in the house, also relatively high, but still a relatively low ceiling, more the expansion in width. It's similar there. So the spatial feeling actually always runs through the house.
In der Breite, das ist ähnlich dort. Also dieses räumliche Gefühl zieht sich eigentlich immer so durch. Mies selbst, der war ja kein Moderner in dem Sinne.
And Mies himself was not a modernist in the sense that he swept aside everything that had gone before. Take brick as an example. Modernism said brick no longer belonged in the New Age. There's the saying, Backstein tut uns leid, dem Glas gehört die neue Zeit. We feel sorry for brick, the new era belongs to glass, or something like that. But Mies, for example, managed to bring brick, which really is a very old traditional building material, thousands of years old, practically into the modern age. You can see this very clearly here at the Lemke House, and you can see it very clearly in the memorial to the victims of the 1926 revolution, which is a massive brick block. Really large monument, 12 meters long, 5 meters high, a really massive building. Then there are the villas by Estes and Lange in Krefeld, which are also very beautiful brick buildings, or what is generally considered to be Mies's first modernist work, the Wolf House in Guben, the first modern cubic building without a steep roof in 1925. So there he really shows how you can deal with brick and modernism. And then there's this famous house in brick, which was just a design from 1923 to 24 and was never built, where Mies practically translated the style movement into architecture.
Den Style in Architektur übersetzt hat. Es gibt immer so die Gegensätze, die der Mies zusammenbringt.
There are always the contrasts that Mies brings together. Glass, steel and brick. There are games like light and dark, or small and large, which he sets in relation to each other. Materiality plays a major role. We have the Mies van der Rohe house here, but you could sort of think through that for all of the buildings. We have this beautiful brick, red-colored brick, a very light brick, which has colors ranging from light red, orange, dark red, with bad joints from the coal firing, which is very beautifully lively. And Mies deliberately used this to set these rough surfaces against the smooth.
Genutzt, auch so diese rauen Oberflächen gegen das Glatte zu setzen. Es gibt einen Brief, wo sich der Karl Lemke...
There's a letter from Karl Lemke to Mies van der Rohe saying that Mies has so little time for him because he has so much trouble at the Bauhaus.
Weil am Bauhaus so viel Ärger hat, so wenig Zeit für ihn hätte.
Das Bauhaus wurde geschlossen.
The Bauhaus was closed, but the professors' contracts were with the city of Dessau, and they couldn't be cancelled. So the faculty was more or less still being paid. And that was also the reason for Mies to set up a private school, as it would not have been possible to pay salaries at all. And the tuition fees that students had to pay at the Bauhaus alone would not have been enough to finance it. So he probably thought, well, the whole team still exists. It's just that the location no longer exists. Maybe Berlin is a better option than Dessau anyway.
Berlin ist vielleicht sowieso eine bessere Option als Dessau. Im April 1933 kommen die Nazis.
So in April 1933, the Nazis came and raided the building and sealed the Bauhaus. It was an old factory building that Mies had rented for 3 years on his own account. And then there is the decision, which is not made until July, that the Bauhaus will not be continued. So, what is Mies doing to keep the place together somehow? They can no longer enter the Bauhaus. And I think that's so great, because Mies organizes boat trips, the floating classroom, so to speak. On 8th of May 1933, they traveled by boat to Paritz and take a look at the beautiful castle or country house of David and Friedrich Gilly. They travel to Schinkel's Charlottenhof. They go on excursions into Prussian classicism. And then they go to some garden cafe. They bring their own cake, and they can talk on the boat. They talk in the cafes. That's the kind of thing that Mies came up with. What can you do as director of the Bauhaus when it's not yet clear whether it can be continued or not in this interim period? There are photos of Bauhaus students sitting in the garden restaurant, and Mies is cutting the cake. There are photos of the boat trip. I wrote a little booklet about it, and that's why I called it Ausgebootet, because they can no longer enter the Bauhaus and are being booted out of the Bauhaus. And Mies takes this as an opportunity to put them on a chartered steamboat. And then you sail across the lakes and have a look around. I think that's terrific.
Dann fährt man da über die Seen und guckt sich was an. Finde ich grandios. So, und dann ist es natürlich kritisch als...
And then, of course, it becomes critical when the Nazis also collect these salaries. And I believe that this is the real reason why he was no longer able to continue the Bauhaus in July, and he justifies it with financial problems. Apart from the political wrangling that took place, and if they removed all Jews from the teaching staff and hired at least one Nazi, and so on, then they could reopen. And Mies then also tried to cancel the lease early so that he wouldn't be stuck with the rent. I think he only partially succeeded. At that time, he was no longer financially viable. Apart from this small house Lemke, the income he had only came somehow from second or third prizes in competitions. It just wasn't financially viable anymore.
Das ging einfach nicht mehr finanziell. Erzählt diese Geschichte.
He tells this story, se non è vero è ben trovato,
which means in English, and if it's not true, it's still a good invention or story.
That the Nazis gave him permission on the condition that Hilberseimer was dismissed, that he then drummed up the faculty and said, "Order champagne and we'll close the Bauhaus on our own." And then he also explained in writing that the Bauhaus would no longer be continued due to financial difficulties. He also tried to find funds somehow. I found a letter that he sent to Philip Johnson asking if he could spare a few dollars and he would in return become an honorary member of the Bauhaus. But that wasn't enough. So the financial side was, I think, the strongest argument. How was that supposed to continue? Running the Bauhaus and paying normal salaries for the professors is, of course, impossible to manage privately. You can understand that.
Privat nicht zu stemmen, das kann man verstehen.
And then comes a time of uncertainties and commissions by the Nazis between 1933 and 38, when Mies accepts a commission to design the pavilion for the World Exposition in Brussels in 1937, for example. This period is far too important and mostly underexposed. This is why the second part of my Mies podcast will be concentrating on this particular time, holding a magnifying glass over architecture at the time and the attempts of Mies to stay in Germany, who was never prosecuted by the Nazis. For some time, he still hoped that, due to his international popularity, he could stay in his home country, where his family, his children, his friends and colleagues lived. I can foreshadow that, in the end, Mies will immigrate to the United States of America in 1938 upon an offer to become head of the Armour Institute of Technology in Chicago, which would later become the IIT, the Illinois Institute of Technology. I asked Fritz Neumeyer if Philip Johnson, director of the Museum of Modern Arts, had to do with Mies's immigration. After all, he had arranged teaching positions at American universities for several Bauhaus masters and students, for example for Joseph and Annie Albers, as Brenda Danilowitz told me in our podcast about the Alberses, which you can find on my podcast website bauhausfaces.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube and elsewhere.
Ja, natürlich. Es geht alles über Philip Johnson.
Yes, of course it's all about Philip Johnson. Without Philip Johnson, Mies would have been a no-name in America. He made him famous in America in the first place, approached potential clients, and so on. And he also had his flat furnished by Mies. And Philip Johnson is the pivot point for Mies. He opened doors for him in America. And Philip Johnson was, of course, also an influential person at the time as director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Philip Johnson, he's a chapter in himself.
Das ist auch ein Kapitel für sich, Philip Johnson. Die haben den Mies verehrt wie einen kleinen Gott in Chicago.
In Chicago, they worshipped Mies like a little god. They were so proud of the fact that they had him and went down on their knees, and they were certainly keen to get him some kind of jobs. And then it was Mies's job to reorganize the campus for the IIT and designing buildings. There's the Mineral Research Building, and how he is using bricks and steel and glass. These are great buildings, so very carefully thought out.
Wirklich tolle Bauten. So sorgfältig durchgedacht.
Der Aufbau der Schule, des IIT in
The construction of the IIT school in America was such a special case. Mies reports that it was a campus site, where there were various requirements for the buildings, and he practically had to find a very simple form that would make it possible to accommodate various functions in the buildings. He then has very simple boxes there, the doggy box. So the students always say, this little chapel there on this side, it's practically just a cube with a glass facade and yellow bricks. Incidentally, in America it's yellow brick. In Europe it's always red brick. That's also interesting, this change. And then There are simply steel glass brick pavilions in different formats, which were then used on this campus and had to fulfill the function on site. The entire complex is also interesting, so you actually have to see this campus area from above, from a bird's eye view, which is again so beautifully, rhythmically structured. The buildings there on the side, just as you did in the Weissenhof estate, or as you know it, so to speak, as a picture of this rhythmic structure of the Revolution Monument, for example. In my opinion, the design of the complex as such, the rhythm, is the most interesting about it. And then, of course, with Crown Hall, he also wanted to develop buildings that were practically neutral, so to speak, where one building could be used for everything, could actually be used for several purposes. That was important to him.
Gebäude entwickeln wollte, die neutral sind, wo ein Haus für mehrere Nutzungen eigentlich auch gebraucht werden kann. Wenn man da einmal in Chicago ist, da ist ja ganz Chicago von Mies geprägt.
Once you're in Chicago, the whole of Chicago is characterized by Mies, so he had a great influence there. And there are many buildings by him in Chicago, but then there are also buildings by his students that all look so similar. And Mies always remains true to himself. So there's the Seagram Building in New York. It's very interesting that he somehow remained true to himself in this building. He set the building back from the building line on the street, so that water basins and trees could be created in front of it, a kind of plateau with wall projections to sit on, with trees and water basins creating an oasis, a place to linger in the middle of the city. So that's where I would say that the Seagram Building has something to do with Haus Lemke, simply in terms of the idea of bringing nature and architecture together in such a beautiful way so that you have to enjoy life. This connection between architecture and nature was a theme that Mies maintained throughout his life. And if you take the early work, Haus Riehl, for example, where geometric gardens were used around the house, continuing on to Haus Lemke, for example. If you draw this arc, where a geometric garden was no longer used, but more of a garden close to nature. And if you then go over to America, then you could say that there is only the natural garden, meaning the wilderness in inverted commas. So no more gardening in this sense. But then it goes the next step into the natural space. So the Farnsworth House, I think, was built in 1945, just 70 miles from Chicago in Illinois, is completely set in the wilderness. Built for a single woman, completely glazed on the outside. You can't even imagine living there. But the connection between man, architecture and nature has actually reached its peak there and is so purist that it really becomes a unity. The architecture with nature and with man on such a higher level. That's what Mies himself says. It's not my invention. He says that when you see nature through the windows of Farnsworth House, more is said about them, about nature, than if they were standing outside. And you can also find this principle in the Lakeshore Drive apartments, where you can practically look out onto Michigan, into nature, and then it's the sky and the water. In general, and this might also be another topic for investigation, pretty much all of Mies's buildings are built on a body of water. And where there was no water, he built in water basins. That's the artist again. Or let's say it has an approach that really wants to bring everything into coherence, into a kind of harmony, which also means that architecture is taken very seriously. So what he has done is always done with a seriousness towards the matter. And it's also something very deeply democratic. You look from the inside out, you look from the outside in, and everything is open, transparent, bright, visible, nothing hidden.
Es ist alles offen, durchsichtig, hell, sichtbar, nichts Verstecktes.
Seagram's in New York ist auch fantastic.
Seagram's in New York is also fantastic, also in terms of urban planning, and the way he incorporated this building opposite the Racket Club, right on the axis, and that's great. And also the podium, and how the high-rise building is conceived in general with this travertine core that comes out of the podium. It's not just a steel frame with glass, but the stone has a very important meaning in it. And I always thought at first that these T-profiles that run up and down the facade would be steel girders dipped in a bronze bath. The whole facade is bronze, It's solid bronze. Can you imagine that? That cost a lot. This is the most beautiful high-rise building that I know.
Das ist also das schönste Hochhaus, was ich kenne. Mies war nicht nur modern.
Mies was not only modern, and as a modern architect, he did not want to simply bid farewell to the past. And that's a big difference to other architects. He always maintained this connection to classical architecture. Look at the National Gallery in Berlin, his last work. It's so obvious, even though it's more minimalist, that you can hardly think, design, and build such a large building. But that was always a matter of course for Mies. That's having both feet on the ground. That also means standing in the tradition and not simply turning away from it, but also reaching your head into the clouds. It means being open to the new, open to the infinite, and both together. And that, of course, also makes for much greater richness. When you see a house by Gropius, the one he built for himself near Harvard, it's a banal box compared to a house by Mies. And Mies was suspicious of this desire to be modern.
Dieses nur modern sein wollen, das war Mies suspekt.
I wanted to know from Fritz Neumeyer if modern architecture necessarily needed to have a flat roof, as is often suggested.
Wenn man moderner Architekt sein will in den 20er Jahren.
If you want to be a modern architect, at least from the mid-20s, it's practically a must. And if you don't do it, it's a taboo. That's as if they were using a pillar or something. That's bad when you do something like that. I mean, if you want to remind yourself of these taboos that modern architecture has set up, then you simply must pick up this book, which Philip Johnson did in 1932 for the MoMA exhibition, The International Style. And there it is quite clear that international style architecture is supposed to be the floating, relief-free box. Even window reveals are frowned upon. Brick, of course, is also frowned upon, especially because it makes heavy things visible or implies them. And this light, plastered box, which somehow barely touches the ground, is supposed to be that. One would almost say all that appeared monumental to these architects, and that was, of course, a mortal sin to show what was heavy. It all had to float, be transparent, light, and that was obligatory for modern architecture.
Alles schweben, transparent, leicht sein, das war obligatorisch. Also hat sich immer grundsätzlich.
So he always dealt with things in a fundamental way, and so fundamentally that it sometimes leads to a house being difficult to live in because of this fundamental nature. Take Farnsworth House from 1945 to 1950, which is basically a temple, and there is no other house that is as radically conceived and built as this house. And of course, it was really difficult to live in there, because Mies didn't want a window, which is also a contradiction. Edith Farnsworth at least had a hinged window installed at the back of the house, so that she had cross-ventilation when the door and this window were open. And if you wanted to light the fireplace, you first had to open the door at the front so that there was any draft at all. Because, of course, in such a hermetic glass box, where everything is sealed and no windows are open, the fireplace doesn't even burn. And if you open the door in winter to light the fireplace, it's not particularly productive if you want to keep it warm. This house is so radically conceived and built, you don't see a single weld seam. The steel girder is sandblasted and then painted white. The window becomes a wall. Maybe Mies really loved Edith Farnsworth. They had an affair and built her a temple. But she didn't even realize it. She just wanted something that was practical to live in.
Und hat ihren Tempel gebaut, aber die hat's gar nicht gemerkt. Die wollte nur irgendwas, was praktisch ist.
Talking about a temple, we also have to talk about the new National Gallery in Berlin, the Neue Nationalgalerie, from 1968. Mies' last building and Fritz Neumeyer's favorite work by Miss van der Rohe. It is the comeback of Mies in the city that spit him out in the 30s at a place where Berlin is divided at that time into East and West. The building looks from an elevated point of view onto Berlin. Let's listen to Fritz Neumeyer's description of this special place.
Also ich kenne die Nationalgalerie jetzt ja auch schon über 50 Jahre.
I've known the new National Gallery for over 50 years, and then some. And every time I go in there, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And it's a space where I have the feeling that I've been uplifted. It's an architecture that doesn't want to knock you down, but it wants to lift you up. It's a huge difference. Today, architects want to knock us all down with sensational aesthetics and everything spectacular and completely unexpected. But there is a calmness in all Mies's buildings. To paraphrase Nietzsche, you can take a walk within yourself when you walk through these spaces.
Man kann, um es mit Nietzsche zu sagen, in sich selbst spazieren gehen, wenn man in diesen Räumen wandelt. Ja, es ist auch wieder so ein doppelter Bau, möchte man.
Yes, it's another double construction, you might say. One in which there is this central contradiction, namely, there is a large podium made of granite, of stone, and on this stone podium stands a pavilion made of glass. You almost want to say it's a temple. It was immediately compared to a temple, and this pavilion consists of a 42 by 42 meter roof structure, a cassette roof, which stands on 8 steel pillars. These pillars are not positioned at the corners, but are pulled out of the corners, which is very clever, and they have an allusion to the classical column arrangement. They each consist of 4 T-beams that are welded together to form a cross in plan, almost a sacred form. A steel beam construction, an industrial element, suddenly becomes something almost sacred. And these pillars also taper upwards, like a classic column that has an entasis, a slight belly. And you have a space that is simply magnificent. The way into this museum is a revelation. You walk up the marvelous grand staircase to the podium. It has a room. It's the only urban space. And at some point, you step under this large roof, which is somewhere, I think, at a height of 12 meters. The steel cassette roof hovers above you. And then the inner space is only enclosed by a glass shell. You enter the building through this glass boundary into an interior space that shows the panorama of the city, but you are shielded acoustically from it. You have this strange, wonderful spatial experience of being in an interior space that is like an exterior space. You see the art against the background of life. So the art is not something that is isolated from life in the white cube, as usually happens with art, but it is placed in a large, wide space, and the urban space. The buildings that appear on the horizon give this space its outer limit, and then you go down to the basement. The classic museum rooms are then located in this plinth. There are cabinets, but also sequences of rooms that are open. When you come down the stairs, you first come into a lobby, and then into a large room from which these museum rooms lead off. And what's particularly nice is that when you walk through the museum rooms, you enter an inner courtyard. When you are in the upper room, where the panorama of the city is, the room opens at 360 degrees, and then you come into a room closed at 360 degrees, into a courtyard, into an atrium with sculptures, and here the roof is the sky. And I think this sequence of rooms is marvelous. You don't get this kind of experience in any other building in the world. And just to experience this space, from the ascent to the podium, to this garden, into this hortus conclusus, and then back into the city, that's a real experience.
Aufsteigen aufs Podium bis in diesen Garten, in diesen Hortus conclusus und dann wieder zurück in die Stadt. Das ist ein Erlebnis.
Mies van der Rohe ist kaum mit Worten zu greifen.
Mies van der Rohe can hardly be grasped with words because his architecture is truly located in the realm of art. And Mies van der Rohe is about beauty, truth, and spaces that Mies created, which are broken down to their very existence, so to speak. In this respect, it is difficult to put into words. We're currently preparing an exhibition about Max Bill, who also studied at the Bauhaus. And there is, as few people know, one of the very first publications by Max Bill on Mies van der Rohe. It was published by an Italian publishing house and is only known in Italian, this essay by Max Bill on Mies van der Rohe from 1955, which is very early in Europe. We are currently working on it because we are now bringing it out again in German to coincide with the exhibition. And it's interesting that there, Mies was still alive. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe was around 70. And Max Bill wrote the same thing. He has a few things to criticize about Mies. You could criticize this, that, and the other, railings, or how this and that is solved. But he loves Mies. And you really can't say what's special about Mies, because he's one of the prophets, one of the great prophets or something like that. So that's not literally, it's just a metaphor. And yes, I feel the same way. Of course, you could say what characterizes Mies is attention to detail, a clear architectural language, a completely new invention of space. So that's what Mies van der Rohe and his buildings stand for. No matter where you are, you simply recognize them. They are his, because it really is a very unique, strong language.
Also dafür steht Mies van der Rohe und seine Bauten, egal wo man ist, man erkennt die einfach. Die sind von ihm, weil das ist wirklich eine ganz eigenwillige, starke Sprache.
Galt ja allgemein als der schweigsame Mann.
He was generally regarded as the taciturn man who drank martinis and smoked cigars, and somehow let a Thomas Aquinas quote pass his lips. And I really wanted to do something about Mies, and thought I had to go to the sources. So I went to the Mies archive in New York, and found about 40 loose sheets from a notebook, handwritten in pencil by Mies, and that was actually the crucial point. Nobody had ever looked at them before because they were in German script and not necessarily immediately legible. And then I slowly deciphered them. It was a bit of a detective job. I realized that I was now doing something about Mies, about his thinking, and I tried to collect everything he had written, published manuscripts or typescripts of speeches, and so on. So, the development and changes in his architectural theoretical self-determination can be understood quite well from his lecture manuscripts and notes. And if you were to try to summarize it, then what seems to be important for him was to reject one-sidedness. He also talks about the dual orientation. There is the path through the subject, there is the path through the object, and of course both must come together. And a sentence that concludes one of his lectures in 1924 is perhaps characteristic of the whole of Mies, where he says that we want to stand with both feet firmly on the ground, but we want to reach our heads into the clouds. That is a wonderful description of this dual orientation, to recognize that we stand on the earth, but not forgetting that there is also a sky above us. This relationship between idealism and realism, not one or the other, but this reciprocal relationship, that is what is important to him. And that also seems to me to be a very important attitude for him, this dual orientation towards the world of technology, but also towards the world of art and the spirit, and to relate them to each other. I think he has also succeeded in doing this quite well in his architecture.
Ich glaube, das ist ihm auch in seiner Architektur ganz gut gelungen.
I really think that what both Fritz Neumeyer and Wita Noack just said in the end concludes this episode about the big myth Ludwig Mies van der Rohe very well. I hope with the help of the Mies experts you too have now a deeper understanding of Mies's architecture, of the duality, clarity and connection to nature in his buildings. At least I do. I will link all of the books mentioned by Fritz Neumeyer in the show notes. Please don't forget to listen to the German bonus episodes too, and to part 2 of this podcast episode with Aya Soika. And if you liked my podcast, please take some time now and go to Spotify, Apple Podcast or YouTube and like or give a 5-star rating to Bauhaus Faces. And above all, please recommend it to friends, family and colleagues who might be interested too. Help spread the word. For bonus material, you can also follow me on Instagram at Bauhaus Faces Podcast. Last but not least, thank you to all of the experts, Wita Noack, Fritz Neumeyer and Iñaki Volante, and to Konrad Feininger for making this podcast episode possible. And now, there's nothing left to say, but tune in next time for a new episode of Bauhaus Faces.